Today, Paul Cézanne is one of the most highly regarded artists of the late 19th century. He lived through a time of intense social and artistic change, and his art bridged this shift from tradition to modernity. The way he challenged existing ideas of beauty, colour, and how to paint went on to inspire a generation of artists. This is the story of Cézanne told through his art. Cézanne was born in 1839 in Aix-en-Provence, a city in the south of France surrounded by hills and the countryside. He grew up in a wealthy family, and his father wanted him to become a lawyer, but Cézanne saw himself as a poet. He spent his free time reading, writing poetry, and exploring nature with his friend, Émile Zola, who would become a celebrated writer. Their childhood rambles through the hills around Aix would later inspire Cézanne to paint high, sweeping views of Provence. At school, Cézanne and Zola were called the Inseparables for how close they were. This friendship would change the course of Cézanne's life when, in 1858, Zola moved to Paris and encouraged Cézanne to do the same. In 1861, aged 22, Cézanne quit law school and moved to Paris to study art. The capital was a world away from his hometown and in the middle of an urban and social transformation. There was rapidly growing industry and changing social conventions for women, as well as widespread poverty, violence, and discrimination. Cézanne tried to capture it all. In Paris, he met other ambitious young artists, including Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and Camille Pissarro. They wanted to find a new way of painting that reflected the world they lived in. This later became known as the Impressionist Revolution. In these early years, Cézanne's paints were so thick that one art critic said they could have been shot out of a pistol. He tried to set himself apart from the fashionable metropolitan artists in Paris whose paintings were championed by the prestigious Salon exhibition. Cézanne said, "The others see and feel like me, but they do not dare. Me? I dare. I have the courage of my convictions." Meanwhile, his paintings were rejected from the official Salon exhibition year after year. In 1870, France went to war with Prussia. Cézanne and his partner, Marie-Hortense Fiquet, fled to L'Estaque, a village on the coast in the south of France. They had met a year earlier in Paris and defied middle-class conventions by living together outside of marriage. Fiquet became one of Cézanne's favourite models. He rarely worked with professional life models and preferred to paint people he was close to, like his partner and child. Their patience allowed him the time to make repeated studies, to experiment, and to hone his portraiture practice. Madame Cézanne in a red armchair was one of the earliest portraits of Fiquet. In this painting, she looks both dignified and enigmatic. The view is close up, but her expression is far away and hard to read. Cézanne went on to paint Fiquet nearly 30 times over 25 years, showing their continuous closeness and partnership. After the Franco-Prussian War, Cézanne returned to L'Estaque many times to paint the local scenery. He wrote, "The views are like a playing card, red roofs against the blue sea." The works from this time highlight his love for his native region of Provence, its landscape and its culture. Art historians would later say that L'Estaque was where Cézanne became Cézanne. Over the next 2 decades, Cézanne continued to travel back and forth between Paris and the south of France. He often worked alongside his friend and mentor Camille Pissarro. Pissarro inspired him to develop his signature technique of considered, measured parallel brushstrokes. Cézanne's colour palette also became lighter, using a small range of colours but in a rich variety of shades. He worked with oil paints, watercolours, pencil, ink, charcoal, and prints. As well as painting outside, Cézanne also worked in his studio. In this highly controlled environment, he could stage objects in ways that allowed him to make focused, intense investigations. His favourite area of experimentation was still lifes. He used the same objects again and again, including bowls, jugs and vases, fruit, and a traditional blue fabric called l'Indien, which you can see here in his painting, Still Life with Apples. All of these items would have been made locally and commonly found in a household in Provence. At the time, still life was considered the least important of the art genres. But Cezanne wanted to show the art establishment just how meaningful these modest objects could be. "With an apple, I will astonish Paris," he declared. In 1882, one of Cezanne's paintings was finally accepted into the Salon exhibition. But by then, he was spending more time away from Paris, in the south of France. One of his favourite subjects from this time onwards was Mont Sainte-Victoire, the limestone mountain that loomed over his hometown. He would paint it more than 80 times at different angles, and even studied geography and geology to understand the mountain better. "I proceed very slowly. Nature presents itself to me with great complexity, and improvements to make are endless," he wrote. The works he created were an utterly different approach to the landscapes that came before him. Although landscape paintings were common in the 19th century, they often featured people or were intended to tell a story or evoke a feeling. Cezanne's methodical observation of the mountain enabled him to create a new sort of landscape, one that deeply engaged with the terrain and conveyed a sense of timelessness. 1899 was a defining moment in Cezanne's life. Now aged 60, he had been diagnosed with diabetes a few years earlier and was feeling increasingly frail. Then, the death of his mother, along with the sale of the family estate, prompted him to sell his Paris studio's contents and settle at his birthplace, Aix. He continued to push his art in new directions. This can be seen in his paintings of bathers, a subject that had fascinated him since his 20s. Cezanne's bathers follow a long history of nude figures in an imaginary landscape. But, breaking with tradition, they do not have a story or represent mythological characters. Instead, Cezanne depicted single figures or groups of men and women relaxing in nature, freeing them from symbolism. Over the years, these figures' curvy and muscular bodies also became increasingly androgynous. In the last 10 years of his life, Cezanne worked on 3 monumental large bather paintings. In 2 of them, he constantly changed the figures' positions, shapes, and outlines. He repeatedly extended the sizes of canvases, adding layers of paint, and experimenting with pigments, tonality, and mark making. As Cezanne rarely worked with professional life models, many of the figures and poses in his bather paintings were carefully studied and adapted from sculptures and paintings in museums. In my opinion, one does not replace the past. One only adds a new link, he said. In his final years, Cezanne pushed against his failing health with bursting creativity. He channeled his concerns into moody, dark landscapes and ominous compositions with skulls. His technique varied from thick oils to layers of delicate, luminous watercolour washes. He continued to find new ways to paint, and for the first time in his career, he made portraits of people outside of the studio. The Gardener Vallier depicts Cezanne's gardener bathed in direct sunlight. His features are shown in distinct but overlapping brushstrokes, sometimes with slight shifts in perspective. A year after Cezanne's death in 1906, the Salon d'Automne held an exhibition in his memory, featuring more than 50 paintings and watercolours. His legacy kept growing and influenced the work of many artists. Today, he is still considered an innovator whose personal engagement with his surroundings and endeavours to develop a new visual language bridged tradition and modernity. The history of painting would never be the same again.